Hi, I'm Shani. I've been working on the Substance Painter Smart Material for our RubyShark game project. It is a game project in which we decided to do a somewhat stylized material design. We wanted to do all hand-painted materials, but we decided to create this generator in order to save time. So I want to talk about what the different layers are, how I went through it, how I made it. After we're done talking about this generator, there will be a time lapse for the rest of the video of models that have been used within the project, and you'll get to see me adding hand-painted details on top of the generator. So basically the generator is a base and hand-painted details go on top of it. So what I'm gonna do is change this to base color so you can see it without lighting, and we're gonna go over what each layer does. I'm going to include in the description of this video the 3 tutorials that I watched and learned from and used methods from in order to create this material. But for talking about which layers and which methods are used, I'll be describing them as Tutorial A, Tutorial B, and Tutorial C. So in most stylized materials, you have a few principles that come up very commonly in stylized art styles for games. You have dark cavities, which are pits of materials that tend to be darker. So basically parts of the materials that go in are darker. Edges tend to be lighter, so you get these shiny edges and brightness along the edges and corners of materials and objects. You get, generally in stylized materials, you'll get a gradient of some kind where it's darker at the bottom and lighter at the top of the entire object. And every once in a while you'll have details like variation to the color and variation to the roughness, which often shows as painterly shapes. Sometimes they're more distinct than others, and sometimes they're quite subtle. So this is the base layer. It includes your basic color, which is just going to show up as a flat color, and your roughness and metallic, so that you can be able to change those variables depending on the object without having to dig within other layers. The next layer up is this dark cavities layer. It's all about putting darkness into the deep inset parts of an object. And all of these layers and generators are determined based on the baked mesh maps of the material. So every time I'm putting this generator onto an object, I'm baking these mesh maps so that all of these layers work. Otherwise, the smart material doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So the dark cavities is done through an ambient occlusion generator, which I learned from Tutorial B. It is inverted to make sure that it puts the coloring onto the dark cavities rather than onto everything except the dark cavities. That way we can set it to a dark color and it creates this shadowing effect on the inside of objects. These 2 layers are used for variation in both the color and the roughness. I learned this from Tutorial C. I chose these grunge max just because they were somewhat similar to the style of the brush that I knew I'd be using for the hand-painted detailings. And the reason that it has this blur slope on each of them is so that it somewhat blurs the grunge and creates a more painterly look. And those are basically the only layers that affect the roughness other than the base layer. The next layers have to do with the light edges that we talked about stylized materials usually having. This layer that creates the light edges is used from a curvature generator, which I learned from Tutorial B. The curvature map basically picks out the edges of an object. I chose this method for this version of the light edges because it's a bit simpler of a way to do it, and I wanted to have these soft edges on here, whereas the other version is sort of sharp edges. That way we can have a little bit of both, and it's not just a single line along each edge, it's a bit of a gradient. This is the layer that does that sharper edge. This layer creates more of a sharp edge along the material. It uses a generator mask editor, which is a general type of generator that allows you to do lots of different things. But we just messed around with all of the different sliders so that we have a very slight edge. And we do a near white version of our base color so that when it is combined with the other version of the light edges, they work together very well, but they are still very distinct from each other. And this version of doing edge detailing for stylized materials I learned from Tutorial A. One of the things that people include very often in stylized materials is a light to dark gradient. There are different ways to do this. It's mentioned in all of the tutorials that I looked at for stylized materials, and I decided to go with this position generator version learned from Tutorial B. I have it inverted so that I set it to a dark color, which appears at the bottom, rather than setting it to a light color that would appear at the top if it wasn't inverted. And I used this position generator method rather than a mask editor method because this was a more simpler way to achieve what I wanted to, and I think it looks a bit better when it's done this way. The last layer of my stylized generator is a baked lighting layer. I put it only at 15% opacity because we don't want to have too much baked lighting into these materials, but I believe that it adds a little bit of detail that might otherwise be missed if it wasn't included even at this low opacity. But we did, for the sake of our design principles for this game project, keep the baked lighting very subtle. As you can see with the stylized generator I created for RubyShark, there is a variety of shades of each color, and I actually went through and created different color versions so that I could mix and match them together when creating the individual materials for individual objects. Our color theory for this project is that the darker a color should be, the warmer it should be, and as the colors get lighter, they should be a bit cooler. We went with this idea because it creates more varied colors within our materials and our objects, and will give our game world a more vibrant appearance. So that's how each of these layers work together to make this stylized generator a very important thing for this project and to make it all look good and work well. Once it's all together, it is put into this folder, exported as a smart material, which I learned from Tutorial B if you want to go watch that tutorial yourself to learn how to do that. And here they are in the smart material tray. When I'm working on a model for the project, I simply drag a color onto the object, make sure I have my baked mesh maps all set up, and it creates the stylized generator on the material. I then go through and put hand-painted details on each of the models, and the rest of this video is going to be a time lapse of me working on some of that hand painting in Substance Painter. Please enjoy.